So welcome back, dear participants, to the second deep dive of this day. We are very happy to have you with us, and it's a great honor for me to give a warm welcome to David Chipperfield, architect, founder of David Chipperfield Architects, London, Berlin, Milan, and Shanghai, and to Edwin Heathcote, architect, designer, and journalist, who are now with us for the second deep dive. We are very happy to have them with us, and we are very happy that they take time to answer your questions. So just to remind you, there are 3 ways to include them in this discussion. If you want to ask your question through audio, you can participate by clicking raise your hand on the bottom of your screen. You can also ask your question by writing in the chat of this webinar, or you use our online forum at campus.re-publica.com. If you are following from a website or YouTube, then we can also include those questions. So let's dive in. I would ask Edwin to give a short insight and a short reaction to David's sprint.
Thank you. And thank you so much, David, for a talk which exquisitely captured the contradictions and the paradoxes which define the world of contemporary museum architecture. This, it seems to me, is also very much the world of Martin-Roth, who tried to tread the sometimes a wobbly line between the popular and the highbrow. The museum as a public forum and a civic space, and as a place in which to ask the difficult questions of how the world came to be as it is, and those questions are not avoided. How did we acquire all these treasures and this wealth? Martin was always amused by the idea at the V&A that the curators were called keepers, as if their job was to keep the objects and not to show them. And in fact, as Bill Sherman just said in the talk earlier, it's one of these places that's very easy to get lost in, but getting lost is part of the charm. The building kind of works against you, but with your induction into a broader culture. Talking of architecture, as we are, I think we could easily make the case that museums have been the vehicle for architects to impose themselves on cities, and for architecture as a discipline to raise its profile. So museums have used architecture, and architects have used museums, whether it's Frank Gehry's Bilbao Guggenheim or the Herzog de Meuron's Tate Modern. There has been this huge expansion, and as you mentioned, the kind of the absorption of the mega museum into a kind of global tourist itinerary, which is questionable in its effects on the city. And Roth himself was part of this expansion, overseeing the addition of the new space at the V&A in Kensington, in East London as well, even Shenzhen. And I'm fascinated that you warn against expansion. I know that you're a kind of a modest and honest architect, and you see you see that this is not an unalloyed good thing. That these buildings are being used in this way as kind of boosters for cities. So if museums now are going to be crippled by the effects of COVID and the lack of funds that results from it, by the effective temporary end of the blockbuster shows and mass tourism, what role, I wonder, do architects have to play in the immediate future of the museum? Is this the end of the cultural spectacular, the blockbuster? Do they need to find another outlet for their fantasies? Or are their skills, conversely, possibly needed even more now? If museums are going to have to try and do more with less. Anyway, your talk, I think it raised all these issues. I hope we might begin to cover them in a little more detail in this deep dive. Can I go over and see what questions we have?
Yeah, we have one question already coming in from the audience by Giovanna, who was asking through our chat. First of all, she wanted to thank you. So thanks for the talk that expressed the uncertainty of the current situation so well. You mentioned building less and being more innovative with the space we have. Can you give us an example of what that could mean in practice also for the museum sector?
Yeah, well, I'll try. Obviously, having built my fair share of museums, it's much easier for me to advise that we don't need to build so many. I mean, it's slightly, I'm aware of the hypocrisy in what I'm saying, but I suppose that it goes back to the general condition that I think we're all having to reconsider, which is question growth as the motivator of so much of what we do. Clearly, museums have been are in a sort of spiral where they, for very good reason and very sincerely, have, I think, in a most fascinating way, as has been said all afternoon, changed their program from a sort of static one to a dynamic one, to become more relevant, to think about outreach through education, through and obviously there's a certain chicken and egg in that, which is to do with attracting more, getting more visitor numbers, which is museums have a lot of pressure to do. But I would say societally, we have in the last years assumed a sort of economic situation which is based on leveraging and optimizing, maximizing everything. And clearly, I think we're at a moment where we have to reconsider that, and museums the same as anything else. And so obviously this goes counterintuitively, because what's happening, for instance, is that art is becoming more and more valuable. And as it becomes more valuable, you have to protect it more. And as it becomes more protective, you have to have the buildings have to become more protective. Just at the point when one would like to have a slightly more informal relationship to art, and the architectural spaces or settings for art might gravitate to the more informal. I mean, you see that in the Venice Biennale, for instance, the charm of work shown in a much more informal. Contradicting that is the fact that art is becoming expensive, and the people that are concerned with it are more and more cautious about the environment. So I think there are opportunities, but I think these have to be really, tackled in a very profound way. It's not something that architects can do, but we can certainly help in the process.
Can I ask something? We as people in architecture and in culture and museums, we often ask, can the museum become a more civic place? Can it be a place of gathering and a social space and so on? But certainly in the UK and in the kind of Anglo-Saxon world, we're seeing an erosion of the infrastructure of public buildings that we used to have, whether it's post offices or town halls or working men's institutions, education, adult education, all these kinds of places which used to provide a public forum. I know that Kieran Long, when he was at the V&A, he tried to set up voting booths for the general election in the V&A. He said, well, we claim to be a public building. Can we really be a piece of public infrastructure? And then it turned out that they couldn't use it because people would have to walk too far to get to the booths, which had to be in a particular place in the museum. So it turned out to be impossible because there were too many kind of regulations in place. But I wonder, in a world in which that kind of public infrastructure is disappearing, can we integrate the museum more into the public sphere?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's both, as you indicate, a reaction to a sort of negative condition that we have less and less territory which is independent of commercial pressures or other pressures. I mean, so much public space in London is not really public space. It's a sort of extension of retail environment. And clearly during COVID, I think we all understood the importance of sort of neutral, real public space, not simulated public space. But certainly as social infrastructure, museums have understood that. They've understood that they offer territory, intellectual and physical. And that combination is very, very rich. Of course, when we talk about museums, it's a bit like talking about animals. I mean, a dog is not quite the same as a cat, when it's not the same as an elephant. The conditions of a large national museum are different to a regional museum. And my experience in America, for instance, in smaller regional cities and museums, is that the museum takes on a critical and very important role within the community.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm nervous that the tendency for museums to be sort of semi-confiscated by mayors and investors to say that you know, a museum will bring more people and is part of that type of you know, I mean, we had it in Wakefield. It was always said, well, it will bring more people, or in turn, I mean, yeah, they will possibly if you do it well. But first of all, you've got to want museums. So I think we've got to be very careful that to disentangle the potential economic attraction. And of course, since Guggenheim Bilbao, there's hardly a mayor in any city in the world isn't attracted to the notion that their economy could do better if they had a iconic building. But my concern is that if this is a contradiction, because if you want to improve museums as social infrastructure, the social that they are infrastructuring has to be local. And if we get to a situation...
And include another question by the audience. Samantha wants to ask her question through the audio function. So please unmute your mic and you can ask your question.
Hello, Samantha.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for a great discussion. I am a recent graduate from the architecture school, Columbia GSAP in New York. And I'm following up, I'm very interested in museums, and I have visited Arles 2 weeks ago and Foundation Van Gogh. And also I went to see the under construction Luma Tower. So it reminded me a bit of Bilbao effect, and I was wondering, what is your impression of the whole project and how it relates to Van Gogh? And on a separate note, I would like to ask you about, Mr. Chipperfield, on your opinion about scale and importance of scale of a museum, especially now when we see that we need to reserve a time slot at the Guggenheim to see, let's say, the countryside exhibition, and on the other side, smaller museums are open to public and there are no restrictions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. I would just give you the floor.
Eddie, are you going to reply to the
No,
first?
No, that's for you. That was for you. I think that's all for you.
Well, I think in a way, the question about Arles continues the conversation in the sense that, you know, first of all, opening a museum anywhere and promoting culture anywhere under any circumstances is a good thing. You know, so that's a given. Then the question is, you know, a more granular discussion under that umbrella. I do think that we have to be careful that art and culture isn't used as an extension of the sort of tourist economy, because I think at the same time we're understanding that the tourist economy has distinct disadvantages and negatives. And I think that clearly the museums, the role that we are fascinated about museums is in a sense what Eddie you raised earlier, is, you know, to what degree is a museum part of social infrastructure as well as you know, a cultural destination. And I think that is a growing project, and clearly it depends on you being relevant to the community as much as it does to tourists. And certainly in Berlin, when we built the James Simon Gallery recently, I would say the purpose of that building in a nest of other national museums was to be an offer to people in Berlin as much as anybody else, by the fact it's got a lecture hall and it's got you know, amenities which the citizens of Berlin might, and that is an issue for every museum. It's a sort of, you know, paradox that they need to attract larger groups, but on the other hand, how do you ensure the demographic split is somehow healthy?
So thank you very much. Maybe Edwin, you can also give us a short insight on how museums can attract more local people instead of being as touristic as David just pointed out.
Well, I think Biche Kuriga in a talk earlier made a very interesting point that the big blockbuster economy of art has come to a screeching halt. It's stopped pretty much entirely now. There's no future really for the huge shows, which cost a lot to mount and rely on huge visitor numbers. But at the same time, the provincial, forgive me using the word provincial, I don't like it, but it's an easy word. The provincial museums, which are smaller and are not geared to mass tourism, but rather to community events, to education, to maybe young emerging artists or local artists, amateur artists even, they're probably going to flourish. I would suspect now. And I think, David has worked on both scales here with the Margate, the Turner and the museums here at the Museum Island in Berlin, and I think it's very interesting that for a long time now our focus, I think, has been on the big blockbusters, on Tate Modern and MoMA, and maybe they will always have a place, but maybe their time as the kind of vanguard is over, and maybe we need to look to the smaller institutions, which can be more nimble because they don't have such huge staffs to maintain. I think it's actually a rather encouraging future, because those institutions are probably more embedded in an actual community and social life.
I think that the last point we should make, and in a way we should complement the contemporary art world, is it takes a lot of kicking at the moment for all of the strange things that come out of this slightly overhyped community. On the other hand, contemporary art has really worked hard to be relevant. I mean, through the things that Peter said, dealing with social and political issues, as well as environmental issues of gender and issues of culture. And I think that has really changed the dynamic in terms of the communication of knowledge and information, as opposed to just presentation. And I think, therefore, contemporary art museums have in some sense have an easier role than if you're presenting Chinese porcelain, because it's not quite so easy to turn ceramics into something rare. But on the other hand, I think what's interesting, the contemporary art attitude has somehow filtered into the more scientific and historic museums, where they are thinking about their collections in those social and political frames. And I think that's also where the whole thing is becoming quite fascinating.
So thank you so much for your time, David Chipperfield, for taking the time to answer the question, also to go in a direct dialogue with the audience. So thanks to our participants. It was a pleasure to have you with us. Also to have Edwin Heathcote with us, who will be with us for the next deep dive with Louisa Hutton as well. So you're about to see her sprint, and then you're going to see David Ajaya's sprint. I hope you enjoy the program, and I look forward to seeing you in the next deep dive at 6:30.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much.